Right, welcome everyone. People are still joining, but we've got a little bit of housekeeping to run through first. So appreciating this is lunchtime and people may take a little while to join. We'll get this stuff out of the way first. So welcome to the fourth in the series of Enabling Water Smart Communities webinars. I'm Alistair Chisholm. I'm Director of Policy at CIWEM. And we're one of the partners in the project. And I'm joined today by George Warren, who's Integrated Water Management manager at Anglian Water. I hope I've got that right. We'll see on a subsequent slide. But just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available in due course. You'll get sent a link to the recording of this particular webinar after the event. But in due course, it will be on CIWEM's YouTube channel. If you do experience any technical issues, Barbara's put a note about this in the chat. Okay, please use the chat feature. Let us know what the problem is, and one of our glamorous assistants, Barbara or Nathan, will do their best to help you in the background. We will be wanting to get your questions for some discussion time at the end of the presentation. So please start putting those into the Q&A, not in the chat, please, as we go through, and we'll pick them up then at the end. George, can you move the slide on, please? So yeah, this is episode 4 in the Enabling Water Smart Communities, number 4 of 5 in total. I've done our introductions, so thankfully you're not going to be hearing from me too much. I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview to Enabling Water Smart Communities. I am working on the basis that probably several of you who are joining this edition in the series have also joined the previous ones, so I'm not going to labour these points. Really, the aim of this project, which is an Ofwat Innovation Funded project, is to look at how essentially integrated water management practice can help build resilience in terms of our water resources and drainage, and put communities at the heart of that. So really looking at new housing development and how the various sectors involved in water management and in housing delivery and development can work together to deliver cross-sector improvements in resilience delivery and stewardship. So there's a project delivery team made up of a number of partners in those various sectors, and the project is overseen by an independent program board made up of a range of regulators, developers, and other sector partners. If we can move on to the next slide, please, George. Really, I probably don't need to tell you much about the range of challenges that this project speaks to, but in a nutshell, climate change and demographic pressure, population growth, development pressure are all coming together in different ways to essentially put our water resources and our flood resilience into an increasingly kind of critical state. So we're facing more than 4.8 billion litres of water deficit between now and 2050. The government has announced it wants to build 1.5 million new homes over the next 5 years, and a lot of that being in the south and the east of the country, where a lot of these pressures are their most acute. And we know that roughly 3 million homes will be at high risk of flooding by 2050 as well. So there's a range of components all coming together to mean that we need to do development differently and make it a lot more sustainable. George, next slide, please. So how do communities play their part in that? What is a water smart community? Well, basically, it is a development where water is a fundamental central factor to its design. And basically that includes issues of water stewardship, where people really are empowered to steward their water use, to be very aware of how much they're using, and really to be enabled to use it in a much more efficient and effective way. And also, on the flip side of that, be aware of how they can manage water in and around their property to reduce flood risk and drainage pressures. Next slide, please, George. So this project kicked off about over a year ago now, 18 months or so ago, and it started off with a discovery phase, very much digging into the literature and the research background around what's going on in these kind of areas of integrated water management across the world, identifying areas of best practice, and also the challenges as well as the opportunities. Fed that through a research process, and out of the other end came a synthesis of the findings, which enabled the project to identify and prioritize a range of what we call enabling actions. And you can access all of the research findings and the synthesis summaries on the Enabling Water Smart Communities website. And the link to that will be in the slides later on. The enabling actions, when we workshop through them, we identified in the region of 65, and then we worked those down to a short list of 3, which focus on values, assets, and stewardship. We've covered a range of those in the previous webinars, but today we're going to be focused on the issues of surrounding assets, and in particular, questions over how we can reuse water more effectively on site within new developments. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to George. This is the work stream that George is leading on, and he's going to tell you a bit more about the work so far and the findings. So thank you, George, over to you.
Thanks, Al, and hopefully you can hear me all. Right, so as Al says, I'm going to talk about the on-site water reuse piece. Like Al says, there is a load of enabling actions associated with this project, and this is just one area of focus at present. So this is probably the busiest slide today, so you'll be pleased to hear. We've broken this piece down into 3 key areas. And before I probably go any further, you can see on the right-hand side, these are the wording associated with some of the enabling actions and some of those that we think that this project, this particular work stream, is helping to address. As Al says, with potentially an extra 1.5 million additional properties in addition to existing local plan growth targets over the next 5 years, it's fair to assume that maybe that could potentially be unachievable on the basis of what Al has posted with regards to water resources challenges, unless we really start to look at new housing growth as having reduced usage going forward. There's lots of talk around the 80 litre per person per day sort of target, which a number of different areas across the southeast are looking to try and propose. Our view in the project is that 80 litres is only really achievable if you start to address some of the uses with an alternative water resource, i.e. water reuse. And that 80 litres can be achieved if you were to feed your WC and your washing machine and potentially an external tap as well. You can achieve that by the 80 litres by knocking those demands off by effectively feeding with an alternative. So the 3 areas that we're going to go through today are around a piece around the regulation. I'm going to quickly touch on that, some issues associated with that. Talk about a roadmap for water reuse, i.e. if we were given the green light, what next? And then go into a little bit, probably more detail around the business case for water reuse, which is sort of touching on the numbers. But it's, this is incredibly important right now. If the government really wants to hit its growth target, then we're talking, almost billions of pounds worth of potential impact if new housing growth doesn't include full water reuse. That's my headline on that one. So regulation. For those of you in this field, you'll be more than aware of this revelation over the last 12 to 18 months. But this is associated with and a rather dull piece of legislation and regulation, I should say. Section 68 of the Water Industry Act 1991. I'm sure you're all very aware of it. But effectively, that states within it the water suppliers need to provide a wholesome quality of water to residential properties for domestic use. And understandably, the majority of people say, well, what on earth is wholesome water? And then you're pointed towards Regulation 4 of the Water Supply, Water Quality Regulation 2016. I know it's sounding riveting, but effectively that states wholesome water equals potable water. So you read that as water supply companies can only provide potable water to residential properties, which makes it very difficult, therefore, to provide anything other than your standard drinking water. And this, I suppose, a large number of people in this field are saying, is this right? Should water companies only be restricted to provide potable quality of water when, and I could just say, if we continue to do that and we continue to use water in the same manner, we're not going to be able to meet the growth targets we're still, that's proposed right now. And therefore, that we believe that needs to change, and that we've been working with DEFRA on trying to gather the evidence to be able to support such changes, and us providing that support to DEFRA. And we believe, and certainly all the noises are coming out, that a consultation will be occurring in early 2025 around this matter. It's not a simple change, but it shouldn't be too complicated, but the consultation will be coming out and giving a bit of explanation as to why this might be necessary and how it might go about. So let's assume that's changed. I don't think we can wait to that point to start getting our ducks in a row. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was help try to develop a roadmap for this water reuse. So the question we asked is, if given that green light, what would the water companies do? And so we brought a number of water companies around the table at a workshop and just tried to go through the challenges, the actions required to address them, and identify actions that sit outside of a water company's control. And we did that by looking at the political challenges initially, some of the economic challenges. You can see in the middle there, we started to map those together. Technological challenges, they are purposefully small. You don't need to look through this. This will be a report that will be produced very shortly. Some of the legal challenges, social challenges, and environmental challenges. And you start to bring all those together to then develop up what are the bones of a roadmap. Now, this is very much a draft, and this represents what the those around the table from the water company perspective start to put together. I think these dates can be challenged as well, but it was a starter for 10. You can start to see there some of the things that, around the guidance around labelling, regulations, the need, so the development of regulations around that, decision around wholesomeness, which we're putting there for middle of 2025, and certain research is needed there, stuff around plumbers qualifications and the likes. The idea being that there's a lot of things that feed into one another, and we want to start to see at what point do we think that we'll be able to get to a point of water companies being able to adopt and own and deliver such reuse schemes. So in terms of the key recommendations that came out, these are ones that starter for 10, so produce a consolidation document. So that's kind of pulling together all the information out there into a single point. Noting that actually things are sort of they're across various different streams, and with the leaving of Europe means actually making sure that there's relevant guidance over here. Hold a regulators workshop, which we have now done. Hold potentially a house builders and developers workshop to better understand the perspective from the development sector, which is something that we are looking into at the present time. Drawing up of a generic reclaimed water safety plan, similar to the water safety plans that are produced by water companies for drinking water supply, but developing up a template, something similar. So it goes through, identifies the risks and hazards, and potential mitigation measures that could occur. the carrying out of a life cycle assessment, cost value assessment, which some of that we've done and I'll be talking about shortly, and then setting up a working group to actually take some of these things forward. So we started with the regulators workshop after that, and how did manage to get a number of different organisations around the table, some of which had not been around the table to discuss this matter before. It led to a really interesting discussion, actually. So our chair of our independent programme board, Jean Spencer, who also chairs the National Water Resources Framework Senior Steering Group, helped sort of lead the discussion around this. I'd say the key points that came out were around the coordination with other consultations, noting that actually water reuse is not alone, and should be viewed with regards to sort of DEFRA consultations on water supply, around the review of building regs, the fallouts and various recommendations within the report surrounding Grenfell, and so on and so forth, and understanding what the implications of those might mean. And then there's sort of understanding and the managing of risk. So there's a real challenge on water security. So they need to be more innovative and explore all options. Around stuff around contamination to potable water supply and how it can be suitably managed and mitigated. Should the reclaimed water be to potable standard, for instance? And there was a large discussion around whether there is a need to meet a different standard or whether actually it's a case of harvesting local supplies for reuse and supply it at a similar, if not the same quality. Doing around the work around cost benefit analysis of multiple scenarios, so better understanding the total costs. We will talk in a second about the capital costs, but actually understanding what the operational costs are associated with it as well. And then comparing that not just against current water supply, but actually around what the future holds. And let's be serious about it. There is the only way of us magicking water to a potable standard will require us to start desalinating the North Sea and and the oceans surrounding us. So, that's the only thing left in terms of potential water resources. Then we need to be looking at that as a cost comparable to that. And then talking about funding. So who pays? Where does the developer set the incentive sit in all this from a water company perspective? Leasehold versus freehold and the issue around that and around who owns, as the impact on the supply chain, noting that there should be no sharp shocks to the system. And a really interesting discussion was had around the accreditation scheme, around particularly talking about installers and plumbers, noting that as it currently stands, you can carry out work on household plumbing work, let's be, without any great, any certification associated with that. You do need that certification if you start messing around with the boiler, and the gas safe engineer. And there are accreditation schemes being developed around heat pumps at the present time. Does there need to be something similar when it comes to your potable and non-potable supply potentially in your home? So these are the kind of discussions and trying to sort of eke out what the issues were. And I think that's the start of conversation. Bear with me one second. So you can see what we're trying to do on the roadmap on there. Okay, now we start talking about the business case for water reuse. I think the majority of people involved in the reuse sector, or even looking at this from an integrated water management perspective, have maybe some ideas as to what an individual household rainwater harvesting device might cost, or even a grey water recycling. When it gets to community scale, it's how long's a piece of string often. And we looked around for any evidence around kind of community scale reuse, and it just showed huge envelopes. So, it could be something between X and Y. And so we thought, let's have a look at this in a bit more detail, because we think there's something we can pull out. So these were the questions we started asking. How much, and looking at the additional cost, noting that if we want to be putting policies in place to try that work, such as a 80 litre per person per day kind of policy in a local plan, that is ostensibly asking for water reuse to be incorporated. So what is that additional cost? placed, the additional financial burden placed on the developer at that point. And if we are to put in environmental incentives as water companies, what's the scale of incentive that may be necessary in order to either incentivize or fund or 100% fund that additional cost? And then going, well, at what density or on what scale do these things start to stack up? I will tell you now, I don't believe that this piece of work has yet answered all these questions, but let's have a look at what we did together. So this is where I start teaching you all to suck eggs to a certain degree. Look at this as being your standard pipe work within a property, and you'll see here we're indicating this is on a community scale, a conventional supply. What we wanted to look at was what happens if we looked at community stormwater harvesting. And I say stormwater harvesting because I think that we need to, from a community scale, it's unlikely we're going to be harvesting rainwater, which would only be off the roofs if you're doing rainwater harvesting. We're actually going to be looking at harvesting rainwater that lands also on impermeable surfaces across the development. And so the sort of pipework that may be involved in that. We also want to understand from a grey water perspective. So taking it from your showers, baths, and basins, that's not, I guess, wastewater that doesn't have a fecal content or any potential contaminants associated with that, and taking that to a separate area for treatment rather than sending it down the sewer to your conventional sewage treatment works, and then taking from that and refeeding back to the system. And in terms of so this is more in the conventional sense of in an individual household, you may also want to have, an alternative would be an individual household rainwater harvesting device, noting that we think we may need to edit this image of ours to show a slightly bigger tank and possibly buried or up in the roof void to supply the WC washing machine and potentially external tap. And if you were to do a grey water recycling, again, taking it from those specific measures and recycling that within the home. So how much would it cost per property? Well, in order to do this, we took 12 development sites from across from within our Gear to Do. So we took it from, I think they range from 40 houses up to about 550 houses at scale developments. We took those and went about redesigning those. We took 9 property typologies ranging from 1-bedroom apartments up to 5-bedroom detached houses, and looked at the internal plumbing of those. So we looked at treatment, collection, external network, and internal pipe work, and tried to gather costs. Now we can do that alone. So we did some of the design within the team, but we also then called in assistance from possibly a number of you on the call within the development industry, within the treatment, those that provide treatment facilities, and those involved in the housing typologies and the like. So we pulled together the costing information with the help of these people, and thank you very much, those organisations that provided that. So let's talk about treatment costs to begin with. So on the right-hand side, I've got here the stormwater treatment costs and grey water treatment costs for the individual. I'm actually going to bring those together and say, okay, well, let's have a look at the average treatment costs across per property basis. I think probably a surprise to me, and maybe for some of you on the online here, was to see that stormwater came out as being more expensive. Now, having looked into this, it appeared there's a couple of reasons as to why that might be. Firstly, and majorly, it'll be around the attenuation tank. So when you're harvesting stormwater or rainwater, there needs to be a fairly large attenuation provision due to the fact that we have maybe had periods of no rainfall. And so that has a large cost associated with it. However, you could say that cost could be borne out of incorporating that within your SUDS design within a development. So I think there is opportunity by incorporating this properly within the design of a development to reduce that quite considerably. The other factor that you need to bear in mind is the inconsistency of water quality from stormwater. on the basis that that's taking up hard surfaces, and so there's potential for petrochemicals to be incorporated within those. And so that, you know, that treatment needs to bear that in mind. Whereas there's obviously a fairly more, well, sorry, that's really poor English, a more consistent water quality associated with just harvesting off residential roofs and likes. And you could say there's a fairly consistent quality associated with grey water, although that's also susceptible to other inconsistencies in that respect. But anyway, it gives you an indication here. And what we're also seeing is there is a point at which this starts to plateau, for want of a better term, where you're starting to see over 200 properties in stormwater, where it starts to become a generalised cost of around £800 per property. And then from a grey water perspective, at about 300 properties or more, it starts to sort of plateau around the kind of £500 per property. I should say that all of these have to be taken with a pinch of salt to a certain degree, but it gives you an indication as to the kind of the point at which treatment really starts to stack up. You know, there's efficiencies or economies of scale associated with it. So let's move on to the external pipework. So we tried to gather these costs from a variety of water companies and self-lay providers from across the industry. The stormwater, as I say, assumes that the SUD strategy performs that collection, and therefore there's no additional cost. So we haven't included for the drainage costs associated with collecting stormwater. I would say when it comes to the grey water collection side, the external pipework associated with grey water collection, I think, in hindsight, we should have approached more of the developers, civil contractors on this, noting that a lot of the water companies actually don't provide this provision, although they'll have costs built in. They very rarely will ever provide that for a developer. And self-lay providers tend to focus more on the water supply side of things. So this was an error in our approach, but I think there's something that we can work on. What it does give us, though, is an indication of kind of scale. So let's go into that a bit more. It doesn't take a genius to work out there's a slight outlier here on one of the provisions of costs there, but you can start to see a general trend down the bottom there. There is a sudden dip in costs associated with a development around the 200 property mark. Now, the reason for that is a very dense development in comparison to the others. And so costs actually drastically decrease. And I'll get onto that in a second around the impact of density on this. But you could broadly say that it's around the sort of £750 per property of additional costs for the non-potable supply around that ballpark. When we get onto the drainage side of things, like I say, I think we would want to do further work on this, because the costs that we've received to date, we don't believe necessarily represent what developers would end up funding. You can see there's a large variation there, although there's a general trend associated with it. But what's quite clear is that the cost is really impacted by density more than necessarily scale. And I think if we were to look at this, we would probably take the view that quote 3, which is the lower band there, probably is more indicative of costs that would be borne out of civil contractors and likes. So if we went into the density side of things a little bit more, here's some preliminary findings around that. I think you can start to see there's a general trend of reduced costs associated with increased density. And if I just nip back to that, you can see on the table on the left-hand side there, quite the scale of increased density associated with that site. Site 6. Hopefully I'm not moving too quickly through this for you all, but yeah, hopefully that shows an indication there. So yeah, you're starting to see a decrease. I think in order to really to agree on that trend, we would want certainly some more developments to look at around the denser, so having a gross density closer to the 60s and 70s as well, to really see that come through. But anyway, this is, like I say, these preliminary findings. And then let's talk about the internal pipework. So we've done We've done the external pipework, we've done treatment, and then you've got the costs associated with internal pipework. So the initial analysis is based on fairly limited data set at the present time, but what we've seen is that internal grey water collection is probably more than the supply piece. But that's kind of understandable, and you can kind of see that almost from the diagrams above the scale of the additional pipework that may be necessary. And understand it is quite influenced by the house typology, understand. So, you know, the more floors there are, the more bathrooms that it's supplying or taking grey water from, obviously it's going to increase the cost per plot. But this kind of gives us an indication here. So properties 1 to 4 on this. So you'll see the property typology numbers along the x-axis on the bottom there. They are detached and semi-detached properties. And they vary in terms of the number of stories associated with them. I should say that what you're looking at here is the conventional pipework and then the uplift, and then the two together, if you see what I mean. So the difference between the bars is the additional cost. So properties 5 to 9 are apartments, and although when you actually look into the data, there's a variance there between 5 and 6 property typology. And what's interesting is that they're both one bedrooms, but one is a student studio apartment type prefabricated approach compared to site 5, and just looking at the different ways in which those would be constructed. But I think the sort of takeaway from that piece of work was around looking at non-potable water pipe work around the £350 per property mark, and grey water collection around the sort of £600 per property mark. So then we get on to, all right, what happens if we go community versus individual? And I think this was quite surprising to us, if honest. And I think this, certainly welcome to challenge on this. What we found actually was that community scale reuse for the scale of developments that we were talking about actually stacked up from literally from the 40 properties on Wars Point. There's elements here and here that could be susceptible to change on this. So, at the minute, the costings that we have in for individual rainwater harvesting units around the £4,000 mark, noting that this includes the pipe work and labour. But there is a large cost associated, with the tank side of things. So it could be that actually that could be incorporated in other means, and that maybe that could be reduced. But then there is a large cost associated with tackling the community scale reuse, which, as I said before, could well be incorporated into the SUDS strategy. And I think what you're seeing here is that actually the community scale, there is not an extra for collection here, which is probably the reason it's coming down so much. But you're starting to see that there. It's a slightly different story when it comes to grey water. And that doesn't come as a huge surprise, if honest. I think our initial thoughts were that grey water may not stack up on a community scale until we got to the denser developments. And you will remember that I mentioned the particular development around that 200 property mark, which is exceptionally dense. And actually, that's when it really starts to stack up. We don't have sufficient data at the present time from those 12 development sites to be able to really show at what density points does grey water start to really kick in from a community scale basis. But at the minute, the quotations that we've had in as household grey water recycling around the 4,500 mark, noting that grey water recycling does not require quite the same storage element or attenuation element, because obviously it doesn't require waiting for or relying upon rainfall in that respect. But yeah, what's key from this is that density really does make up have a huge impact on grey water recycling. So kind of the key findings, I guess, from this piece is that community scale stormwater reuse offers probably the greatest potential to deliver cost-effective water savings. And that grey water reuse really isn't about scales, it's more about the density of it. But yeah, and we will definitely need more data in order to reduce some of those uncertainties. So this is all being pulled into a report that under enabling more smart communities that Simon pulling together. One thing I failed to say at the beginning, as part of this, none of the water companies and no one other than Simon have been able to see the actual data, the costings. We are trying to ensure that we don't overstep any sort of commercial boundaries here and conflicts associated with that. So all data has been sent directly to Simon for them to analyse rather than us looking at ourselves. So have been assisted by an expert in this field, under that commercial confidentiality agreement. So,
I understand.
Sorry, my Siri just decided to talk to me. So yeah, that will. This has been done with that in mind, and then yeah, the report will be due out in early November. In terms of intended audiences for this, so from a housing developer perspective, we think hopefully it will be incredibly valuable in terms of giving some insight into the capital costs of installing and incorporating these within developments. From our local planning authorities, we hope that this could provide supporting evidence, basis for policies and plans, as well as the assessments of planning applications where water reuse may have been required or be considered to be beneficial. Noting the kind of reference to 80 litres per person per day or less. From a water company's perspective, hopefully this can help inform the environmental incentives linked to water demand management and appropriate program scale or incentive quantum that might be used there. And then from a central government and its regulators' perspective is to help inform policy development related to water resources demand management, as well as planning such as water resources management plans and drainage wastewater management plans. So yeah, just to kind of wrap up, I think, because I'm slightly quickly running out of time here. This webinar hopefully has been helpful and of interest. It is one of 5 in the series. Hopefully some of you have been to attend some of the others. For some reason I only have 4 listed here. That's my bad. But yeah, there is still 1 remaining, and I think there'll be links sent round on this, and hopefully that will be placed in the chat shortly, if it hasn't already, for the stewardship focused one. We have loads of information currently on our website, and we're using Medium and Notion, 2 different platforms as well, to share some of the insight articles and engagement associated with that. I'd really encourage you to follow our LinkedIn profile on there, where we post about various things coming through, and engage with that, as I think we see a large element of the audience associated with this project as being within the professional, professional sector. But yeah, please have a look at that. And I think that's me. Is that all right? Yeah.
Sounds great, George. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I think we will open things up to the floor and for some Q&A. There are some questions. We'll dive into those in a second. But just to give any others who want to pose any questions a little tiny bit of time to do so. Just in terms of this work stream, what are the plans for next steps on it?
So with the wholesome water aspect, we're somewhat waiting upon movement from DEFRA on it. We have developed up some evidence for them around sort of international best practice and the likes, and so we're slightly waiting on them on that. On the roadmap piece, I think we're going to be writing up the recent regulators workshop, and then trying to understand, and then look at this developers workshop. Ultimately, it's about trying to sort of sound out the relevant people to ensure that we've got the right kind of timelines, and then we'll look at ways in which we could potentially fund things like the template for a reclaimed water safety plan and the likes. In terms of this, the latest piece of work around business case, I think there needs to be more data in this to really look at it. I think we've learned from the call out to organisations to get this. If truth be told, it's been tough to try and get you to pull these costs together. And I think there are, hindsight is a wonderful thing in terms of the method of obtaining that. And I think also the number of developments and the range of developments, I should say. I think we would look to try and bring in more into that piece. So I think there's that piece of work is a really good snapshot in time. It gives us an indication. I think if we could build on that in terms of, I guess, more denser developments would be useful, as well as ensuring we get a wider range of costs provided. I mean, I reiterate, thank you very much for anyone who did provide it. I think there's more that we could do in that field. So that's, those are the next steps. I think there is another next step, which probably says we then need to start looking at the total expenditure associated with that. So we've just got done on capital, but really, could we start to have a look at what it costs to run, own, and operate and maintain that such systems, which I think means various different strands of work, looking at what the potential ownership models might be. I hope that makes sense.
Right. Lovely. Thank you, George. Okay, so we've got a few questions, and I think some we can rattle through quite quickly, but there's others that maybe will elicit a little bit more discussion. So I'm going to start from the very top, and the first one with regard to the roadmap piece is from Rebecca Lovell, who was asking if you're including consumers in the discussions around the roadmap piece, particularly around things like education and behaviour change.
So I would say that we haven't engaged with consumers on this that particular piece. There's other work that's going on around engagement, but I think it's absolutely critical that we understand people's perception around it. There is a piece of work that is happening through Enabling More Smart Communities that a Public First are undertaking, which is surveying over 4,000 residents around their potential, their views towards water reuse, and likes to understand the perception element to it. But I think all of this, if suddenly new builds do have to incorporate water reuse, there will be a general public education piece that's needed, as well as the trades around, we are a nation of DIYers. It won't just be trades that start messing around in the house with plumbing and pipe work. So let's ensure that everyone is aware of what that particular pipe is for, if it were to come into fruition.
Brilliant, great, thank you. Okay, so there was a question specifically around whether or not the cost benefit analysis or the cost analysis here referred back to the research done by Ricardo for WaterWise a couple of years ago. I mean, I can answer that one quickly. No, it doesn't at this point. We were just focused on getting in the cost data and analysing it, but we will look and kind of ground truth it against other existing evidence that is out there. So that is something that we will
I would say that one of the reasons we did this was off the back of that great report that Ricardo did, and the fact that it does some really interesting work around individual rainwater harvesting, grey water recycling. But then when it starts out on the community scale, the envelope of kind of how much it costs varies so wildly. And actually it was built as trying to build off existing examples out there of community scale reuse and grey water recycling. And actually what we found is that there aren't that many case studies out there. And sometimes they were delivered for other reasons, and that it wasn't that the most cost efficient means wasn't necessarily pursued. So, which is why we've done this hypothetical costing exercise, which I think is an alternative route by which to develop those costs.
Yeah, George, you just touched on case studies and examples of where it's being done elsewhere. You're looking to map that out, aren't you?
Yes. So we're pulling together a piece of work which I think was, it may have been referred to in, I'm trying to remember which one it was. Maybe it was the second of our webinars on by Thames Water. So Thames Water are leading a piece of work with WSP to pull together a map of all the case studies across the country showing where water reuse, as well as other enabling water smart community measures, have been incorporated. Just giving some of the general facts around it, and whether it's still operational, who's operating it, kind of, you know, why and what it does, and then probably referencing, you know, praising a reference towards where further information can be found. The idea being that if you're interested in this and want to see it in practice, then you just have to look at the map to see where you need to go to find out more information and potentially visit. So that should be, I think it's a matter of months. In the coming months, it will be released at least in a beta version.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. And actually, kind of related, Rebecca Lovell has asked whether or not we're running any pilots around this, or generally within EWSC.
So one of the reason, the initial idea was to run to develop up a load of pilot sites, demonstrator sites, I think we referred to them, and we soon came a cropper with this wholesome water regulation. None of us want to put infrastructure in that could potentially become ghost infrastructure. So we decided to go pivot slightly, and we're looking at sites where there has been reuse installed and for one reason or another has been turned off, and trying to understand why that's occurred, what's needed in order to get these back up and running, and, you know, and put the relevant stewardship processes in place. So that in that respect, those would be our demonstrators or pilots. There are plenty of developments that want to do this, but are somewhat at the minute kind of stopped from a regulation perspective because they want to clear adoption route. So yeah, there are discussions in process, but until that wholesome water regulation is addressed, we are sticking with the kind of utilizing existing developments. There are plans also from a grey water recycling, internal grey water recycling perspective, to look at those as well. But yeah, I think watch this space in that regard.
Great, thanks. Okay, so there's quite a lot of questions coming in very quickly. Sarah asked about whether the per property treatment costs were per year or for whole life. I think we can say they're just the capital costs, aren't they? So yeah, and that's it. So that's a whole nother dimension that might need to be looked into in the fullness of time.
Absolutely.
So in terms of the, I guess the stormwater harvesting, Rob Sweet has asked whether the analysis took into account the spatial variation in rainfall and normalising the costs, like sizing of the stormwater systems,
yeah,
water available for reuse was done. Again, no, not being done at that level of detail at this point in time.
The assumptions on the basis of for the treatment providers and the likes were that we used rainfall patterns associated with the southeast, particular Anglian region, on the basis that this is going to likely be driven predominantly in the southeast at present with the issues associated with water resources. But no, I mean, I'd say that ultimately, other than the treatment aspect of it, which actually we've just had to go, you know, the scale of these developments is such that there should be sufficient yield in order to do it. But we had to provide that data, and all the treatment providers and the attenuation associated with that were calculated on the basis of Anglian water kind of, or Anglian region rainfall patterns. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the problem is just how bespoke do you want to go for each individual area? The idea being it would be a generic provision.
Okay, so a bit more of a generic one. I'm looking at these questions and they're jumping around as people are putting new ones in, so it's a little bit difficult to follow. But Gala Pinto has asked how the UK compares to other nations in terms of reuse, and are there any lessons that we can be applying from those places? That was a question that we discussed possibly touching on anyway, didn't we?
I mean, I think, yeah, there's loads we can learn from it across the globe, and I think this is what's so frustrating sometimes for those of us who've worked elsewhere, is that, you know, this has been done, and successfully, in large numbers of places, whether that be the US, Australia, even mainland Europe. And it's done success. There have been scenarios where there has been, they've progressed down this route and there have been issues. And I think those are the really interesting ones too. So there's parts of the Netherlands where they had a large program for community scale reuse, and the implementation was not as desired, with some quite significant misconnections that occurred, which meant they paused or in fact cancelled the program rollout. Now there's, you could say, okay, abandon it, never do it again, or you could learn from that to try and mitigate against those risks, knowing what they might be, because there's plenty of places that have incorporated it and have done it successfully, and successfully mitigated against those issues. So yeah, like Gallo, I think you and I both know from working together in Oz that it's done elsewhere and it's done well.
Lovely. So Janet Manning asked around the appetite for retrofit. This is all set in the context of 1.5 million new homes over the next 5 years. There's 25 million existing households. Is there any appetite for retrofit?
I mean, I think we've all got an appetite for retrofit, but I think we all know that those costs are going to be quite different for retrofit, certainly when it comes to the internal pipe work. If you're trying to supply it internally with WC flushing and washing machines and the likes, I think there possibly is an appetite, but I think the appetite at the present time is those who want to do it for other reasons than financial. I don't think it stacks up financially to retrofit right now, but there will be good reasons to do so going forward. And I'd say that there's a large push of retrofitting such reuse schemes in the commercial sector in particular, where it does seem to be working at present. But yeah, Janet, you're absolutely right. Like, this is my view is, well, at least we've got to get the new builds going right, and then hopefully we can start looking at how you and I can do it to our own properties without too much fuss.
Okay, thank you. There's a question over kind of the collected water quality. You mentioned that grey water, you're collecting wash water, essentially doesn't have a significant fecal load. Laura's asking whether the fecal content associated with stormwater collection and treatment was considered, noting the potential clothes washing machine use.
So there's a bit of feedback there. So I'd say on the stormwater side of things, like I think we took the view and worked with the UK Rainwater Management Association as to what water quality assumptions we should make with regards to stormwater. And I think they also indicated that you've always got to take the worst case scenario in terms of the petrochemical loads and what other nasties could be poured down it. From a grey water perspective, I think we had to also lean on those that are involved in grey water recycling as to what typically the water quality that they would proceed to include within that. What's interesting is just this also comes with user behaviours and education. So the knowledge that if you're pouring something down the gully that may sit outside your house that then leads to your stormwater harvesting, that actually, you could be doing some significant damage there to the ability for that to filter, and that will end up in your property at a later date. Or the knowledge that actually what you dispose of down your bath plug hole, also from a grey water recycling perspective, could have an impact on that. So there's an education piece there. In terms of the water quality of the non-potable coming back, we used the European standards and British standards around the quality that's required for that. So that was treated to those standards to provide that for washing machines and WC flushing.
Okay, thank you. So I'm conscious of time. I think we'll take a couple more questions. So there's one you touched on, what the options were if these kind of approaches weren't taken forward, and they could be quite pricey ones like desal. So there's a question here around ultimately who has to fund this and pay for it? Will it basically fall on homeowners through increased utility bills? But I wonder, what the cost comparisons might be to other major infrastructure options.
Well, and I think that's what we're trying, and I don't think we've done that analysis in full yet in terms of what the other water resource costs might be. Certainly, if you start to compare it to desalination, the costs that we're coming up with here look really quite favourable. And I think one of the things we want to do in sort of the next piece is to look at that in comparison, the comparisons, but also look at the carbon impact as well. For me, it seems, there is a point at which it becomes more carbon intensive to be putting in a load of more infrastructure. But then you've also got to factor in the whole transporting sewerage away, or and the bringing it back. And I guess from a water supply perspective, so that all of those need to be balanced off with conventional approaches. Now, I think we don't do is compare it to the cost of delivering water at present, because there is no more of that. It's not going to continually cost the same. I'm not talking about customer. It's just I'm talking about, from a water company, the cost of unlocking additional water resources, and that's where we've got to look at. So in terms of who funds it, I think it's going to be a mix, of how it's funded. But ultimately, I think whether it comes through water utility bill, whether it comes through council tax, whether it comes through the uplift in costs associated with buying new property, it comes down to the general public will end up funding it. But it's about it not being an additional. It's like that is trying to make sure it is the most cost efficient alternative in this instance.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, last one, and it's an interesting one. This so it comes from Tom Palmer, Southend Council. So he's saying, in terms of accreditations, is there potential for these kind of capital schemes or other schemes delivered by other risk management authorities to basically get some kind of water reuse certification? And he's compared it with certifications like Building with Nature, so that they can effectively be used as source points. So built to certain standards, potentially that collected water treated to certain standards. Is there a need for multiple water quality standards based on source locations as the kind of the easiest way to help provide this kind of storm collection?
I think those conversations are happening to a certain degree with regards to local resource options, and looking at the opportunity for whether it be the agricultural industry to be providing large reservoirs that can be tapped into in when needs must. And there's a development that we're speaking to at the minute that potentially providing a reservoir that could ultimately feed a public water supply, eventually. So I think there is a potential there. I think we're a little way off, but I like the idea that that would, to me, become a water smart community that's making the use of water that it is capturing on the site, or wastewater that it's generating in the site, to make the most of it, whether that be from a local perspective or potentially feeding back into, what's a better term, the grid in a way. I think we need to look at what our the energy side of the utilities industries are doing right now, in terms of a mix of national infrastructure and local, in terms of that supply. And I think there are some synergies with water there, and the opportunity to do something similar. But yeah, Tom, I think there's some work to be done on that. Honest.
Lovely, thank you very much. So there was a few questions that we didn't manage to answer in conversation, so we'll try and do that in writing afterwards. Conscious of time, so George, do you want to just wrap us up?
Absolutely. Well, look, it's more. Thank you very much for spending your lunch hour probably listening to me babble on about this work. Please do get in contact if you have any questions, and link into us. We've link it LinkedIn, or even going onto the website. There's loads more that's coming out of this project. This project officially comes to an end in December 2025. but the work doesn't stop there. We know that, and we'll be looking at opportunities to try and take this forward even further. So yeah, you know, ultimately we require your engagement in it to really see it come into fruition. So please let us know where we're going well, let us know where we're going wrong, and correct us in along the path. You know, we are trying our best to try and, you know, unlock some of the more information that may not necessarily be out there at the present time. So yeah, work with us, and thank you very much.
Thank you, and do join us on 6th of November for the final instalment, part 5, the next final one in this series.
Indeed. Cool.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks very much for joining us.